It's just after 5 in the morning. The house is silent, the kind of silent you only get before the world wakes up. Cool air. A light breeze at the window. And then she hears it. A low, steady droning, somewhere down in the floorboards. It isn't loud. It's worse than loud. It's persistent. A throb, like an idling diesel engine, parked somewhere just out of reach. She checks the furnace. The fridge. Nothing running. And still the sound presses against her chest. So she wakes the others. Do you hear that? That low rumble, under everything? They stop. They listen. And they look at her the way you look at someone describing a color no one else can see. The room is silent to them. Here's the strange part. She isn't imagining it. Across the world, others describe the exact same intruder. A hum. Not in their ears alone, but seemingly in the walls, the bones of the house, the air itself. Always low. Always maddening. And no one can find the source. Not the neighbors. Not the engineers. Not the scientists who've chased it for 50 years. A sound heard by many, denied by most. So what exactly is humming in the dark? And why can only some of us hear it? That droning in the walls, the sound no one else in the room could catch, it isn't a private haunting. It has a name. Researchers simply call it the hum, and it's been described in nearly the same words on 4 continents. So what exactly is it? A persistent, invasive low-frequency noise. Some hearers call it a hum. Others, a rumble, a drone, a throb that never lets go. It sits low, beneath the ordinary sounds of a house. And here is the detail that makes it so strange. It's audible to many, but not to all. 2 people can stand in the same kitchen. One is tormented by the noise. The other hears nothing at all. It's been reported in Australia, in Canada, across the United Kingdom, and throughout the United States. Different landscapes, different climates, thousands of miles between them, and the same low complaint rising from ordinary neighborhoods. So people started naming it for the places where it grew loudest. In a high desert town in New Mexico, it became the Taos hum. In an industrial city on the Canadian border, the Windsor hum. Same phenomenon, different addresses. But the same name can be misleading. Because when investigators looked closely, they found the hum doesn't appear to be a single phenomenon at all. And the deeper they dug, the further back the trail ran, all the way to a study from 1973. Those place names each carry a story, but the paper trail runs back further than Taos, further than Windsor. To 1973, to a report that gathered 50 people who all swore they heard something. A university study, 50 complaints, 1 shared torment. Each described the same thing in their own words, a low, throbbing background noise. A pulse under everything. And in the very same rooms, others heard nothing at all. When researchers measured it, the sound had a signature. It peaked, always, somewhere between 30 and 40 hertz. Down at the floor of human hearing, where a note stops being music and becomes a vibration you feel in your chest. But here is the strangeness. The hum didn't come whenever it pleased. It arrived on conditions. Cool weather, a light breeze, and, most often of all, in the still hours of early morning. Why would a sound need cool air and a gentle wind to reach you? Why the hush before sunrise, when the world lies flat and quiet? A noise that seemed to wait for the perfect conditions to be heard. And it had a territory. The reports clustered, tight, inside a band of land only about 10 kilometers wide. 6 miles. Step outside it, and the throbbing simply stopped. What could draw a boundary that clean across open country? That same pattern, a sound only a handful could hear, surfaced again 2 decades later, in the high desert town of Taos, New Mexico, tucked against the Sangre de Cristo Mountains where the air runs thin and cold. By the early 1990s, so many residents were complaining of a persistent low drone that investigators arrived to test whether the thing was real, or whether an entire town had convinced itself it was hearing something. The results were strange. At least 2% of the people tested could genuinely hear the hum. Not a majority, not a crowd. A small, scattered minority insisting on a sound the rest of the room could not detect. But here's what made no sense. When researchers measured what each person was hearing, no two matched. One reported the tone sitting near 32 hertz. Another placed it far higher, closer to 80. A single phenomenon, heard at a dozen different pitches. And it wasn't a flat tone. The sound pulsed, modulating between half a hertz and 2 hertz, a slow throb, swelling and fading the way a distant engine seems to breathe. How could one noise sound so different to each person hearing it? What unsettled the investigators most wasn't Taos at all. It was that an earlier British study had already found nearly the same thing, the same scattered minority, the same mismatched frequencies. Two towns, an ocean apart, hearing the same impossible chorus. Each of them tuned to a slightly different note, the same eerie fingerprint the earlier British study had found. But if the frequencies scatter so wildly, who exactly are these people who catch the sound the rest of us walk right past? You might expect a pattern. Some particular kind of ear, some vulnerable few. Yet the surveys turned up something oddly democratic. Roughly equal numbers of men and women report hearing it. Whatever this is, it does not care about the shape of you. But one thing does seem to matter. Age. The hearers skew middle-aged, people well into their working lives, past the sharp young years you might have guessed. Why should this low invasive drone find its way most often to those particular ears? And here the story bends into something almost stranger. For some hearers, the sound has a boundary. Get in a car, drive far enough, and it fades. It thins. It lets go. One Taos hearer traced the edge of it precisely. 30 miles. That was the range this person reported before the droning finally released its grip. Which raises the unsettling question buried inside all of it. If you can outrun the hum, then something out there has a location. Something is a source, but not everyone can outdrive it. For some, the sound follows them home, into every quiet room, every sleepless night. And for a small number of hearers, the droning stops being a nuisance and becomes something far darker. Picture a person who cannot remember the last hour of true silence. The rumble is always there, beneath the fridge, beneath their own breathing. They tell doctors. They tell family. And again, the answer comes back. No one else can hear it. Imagine that pressure never lifting. Days become weeks. Weeks become months. The mind, denied rest, begins to fray at the edges. What does a sound do to a person when it will not let them sleep and no one believes it exists? In the United Kingdom, the toll became impossible to ignore because the hum there has been linked to at least 3 suicides. 3 people who, according to reports, could no longer live inside a noise the rest of the world refused to hear. 3 deaths, blamed on a sound with no confirmed source. That is the cruelest edge of this mystery. Not the strangeness of it, but the suffering. And it raises the question everyone kept asking. Was the hum out in the world, or somewhere inside the hearer? For every hearer driven to the edge, there were others who wanted proof they weren't imagining it. If the hum was real, surely a machine could catch it. Half a world away, in New Zealand, one man decided to try. His name was Tom Moir, a researcher at Massey University in Auckland. Residents across the city had been describing the same maddening drone, a sound that hung in the air of certain neighborhoods and refused to be located. Before he ever pointed a microphone at the night, Moir went at it sideways. Using simulated sounds, he tried to reconstruct what the hearers described, tuning tone against tone until people said, "Yes, that's it. That's the one." That reconstruction pointed to a single, stubborn number, around 56 hertz, a low, buried tone near the floor of human hearing. But a simulation is only a guess given shape. Could he catch the real thing? Then, in 2006, he did. Moir made several recordings that appeared to capture the Auckland hum itself. No longer a memory described by hearers, but something pressed onto tape. For once, the sound in the walls had left a trace. Moir chased his hum across a quiet bay in New Zealand. But halfway around the world, a far angrier sound was about to wake an entire city, and it would arrive not as a whisper, but as a rumble in the floorboards. Late in 2011, in Windsor, Ontario, residents began to notice it. A low, droning vibration in the dark. Not quite a sound, more a pressure. Something you felt in your chest before you understood you were hearing it at all. It came and went. Some nights, nothing. Other nights, the whole neighborhood seemed to thrum. People pressed their hands to walls, to window panes, trying to find where the shaking lived. And the complaints started climbing. Then came one evening in 2012. On that single night, officials received 22,000 reports of the droning vibration. 22,000 in one city, in one evening. How do you dismiss a noise that many people insist is real? So they looked for the source, and every needle on the map seemed to point the same direction. West, across the water, toward the Detroit River, which cuts a border between two nations. Toward a place already heavy with fire and metal. Its name was Zug Island, a heavily industrialized stretch of River Rouge on the north bank of the Detroit River. Furnaces, steel, machinery running through the night. If the hum had a home, investigators believed it was there, but reaching it would be another matter entirely. The trail led straight to Zug Island, and there it stopped cold. Because to prove that mountain of steel and smoke was the source, someone had to actually stand on it, with instruments. And that turned out to be the one thing no one could do. Canadian officials, chasing the vibration rattling Windsor's windows, asked their neighbors across the water for help. The suspected source sat on American soil. So they made the reasonable request, let us onto the island, let us measure. The answer came back as a refusal. Local authorities were stymied, that was the word. No access. No measurements at the fence line of the thing they most needed to test. How do you convict a suspect you're never allowed to search? The investigation had a prime candidate and no way inside. Suspicion settled on steel, the blast furnaces, the enormous machinery of iron and fire. Surely something there was throbbing at a frequency the whole city could feel. It fit the timeline of complaints. It fit the location. And then the theory hit a wall. Because officials stated plainly that no new equipment had been installed nor activated around the time the noise first crept into Windsor's homes. Nothing had changed on that island. So what, exactly, had suddenly started to hum? The question sat unanswered for years. Then came April 2020. The blast furnaces on Zug Island fell silent, shut down. And with them, the droning that had tormented Windsor for nearly a decade simply stopped. The proof arrived not by entering the island, but by the day it finally went quiet. Windsor's furnaces went silent, and the droning followed them into the dark. But another American city had already lived through that same hope, in a place where the machinery never stopped. Kokomo, Indiana. Kokomo was a factory town, threaded with foundries and casting plants, the kind of place where a distant rumble is just the sound of work. So when residents complained of a low, invasive drone, engineers went looking for a machine. And for once, they found one. The first source, investigators concluded, was a steady 36 Hz tone radiating from a cooling tower at the local Daimler-Chrysler casting plant. A single, throbbing note near the low end of human hearing. The second was lower still. A 10 Hz tone, they said, coming off an air compressor intake at the Haynes International plant. 2 machines, 2 frequencies, both sitting exactly where a low-frequency hum should be born. So they fixed them. The tones were corrected, the machines adjusted. On paper, the mystery of Kokomo was closed. The town could finally sleep in silence. Except the reports kept coming. People still lay awake, still felt that low pressure in the walls, long after both machines fell quiet. If the sources were gone, what exactly were they still hearing? Kokomo showed how a hum could resist even the right answer. But cross the Atlantic, and you find the rare places where the answer actually held. In 2021, the droning surfaced in the German cities of Frankfurt and Darmstadt. In Darmstadt, investigators did something unusual. They kept looking. And a year later, they didn't find one culprit hiding in the dark. They found several, all mundane, all mechanical, scattered quietly across the city. 2 faulty air conditioning units, a failing heat pump, and 3 structural noise protection measures bolted onto energy plants, the very devices meant to make things quieter. Each ordinary. Together, a chorus low enough to crawl through walls. Darmstadt was a triumph. But hold it up against the world's long ledger of hums, and it looks almost lonely. Because across every reported case, in every country, how many hums have ever been firmly linked to a mechanical source? 3. Just 3. After decades of complaints and instruments and stubborn investigators, only 3 hums have been pinned to a machine you could point to and switch off. Every other droning voice in every other town remains, technically, unexplained. For every hum quietly solved by a faulty fan or a rattling heat pump, dozens more stay open files. And one man in Connecticut refused to let his go. His name was Steve Kohlhase, and he was a mechanical engineer. He worked with the machinery of industry for a living. So when a low droning crept into his own world, he didn't dismiss it. He measured it. And what began as curiosity became something closer to obsession. Over roughly 10 years, Kohlhase poured about $30,000 of his own money into it. Legal fees, equipment, filings, a private citizen funding a scientific hunt no institution would pay for. In 2019, filmmaker Garrett Harkowicz turned that decade into a documentary, Doom Vibrations. The film followed Kohlhase's slow, stubborn journey to name the source of the noise and the theory he'd built along the way. His conclusion pointed underground. In every case he studied, Kohlhase said, the hum locations shared one feature. They sat along high-pressure gas pipelines, or at the very least, close to them. Miles of steel, carrying compressed gas at enormous pressure, humming beneath quiet neighborhoods. Was he mapping the true skeleton of the sound? Or seeing a pattern in something far harder to pin down? Pipelines, cooling towers, blast furnaces. For every physical culprit anyone chased, the sound kept slipping the net. And in 2009, a man who'd spent his career listening to what patients heard offered a very different kind of answer. His name was David Baguli, head of audiology at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. He'd sat across from countless people describing a droning no one else could hear. And his conclusion cut straight down the middle. About a third of the time, Baguli said, the problem was real and physical, out there in the world. An industrial fan grinding away at a nearby factory. Machinery humming through the night. Something you could measure and, in theory, switch off. But the other 2/3? That, he argued, lived somewhere stranger. Not in the walls, but in the listening itself. People focusing so keenly on some innocuous background sound that it swelled into a torment, Hearing, he suspected, that had simply grown too sensitive. You might expect a man saying that to dismiss the whole thing. He didn't. Most people treat the hum as a fringe belief, he admitted. Because it's so subjective, people claiming to hear what most cannot. And yet, when you look at the sheer number of people who say they hear it, Beverly insisted, it's obvious something is going on. The majority of cases, he conceded, remained unexplained. Even the man dividing it neatly in two couldn't name what haunted most of them. So whether it lives in the world or in the mind, the hum refuses to end. It keeps surfacing, city after city, year after year. In 2021, residents of Frankfurt and Darmstadt in Germany began reporting the same low invasive drone. 2 years later, the sound crossed the water to Ireland. In 2023, people in Omagh, in Northern Ireland, described the same persistent rumble, a droning presence that some could hear and their neighbors simply could not. Then, in November 2025, it reached the far north. Citizens of Whitehorse, in Canada's Yukon, reported a low mechanical humming. One resident described it with a strange, unsettling phrase, repetitive and random. Quote, "There was a plausible suspect. That season, with hydropower running low, Yukon Energy had been leaning on diesel generators. But the utility issued a statement. It was unlikely, they said, that the sound of those generators could reach distant neighborhoods. Unlikely. Not impossible. And that hedged word sits at the heart of the whole mystery. Across half a century and a dozen countries, only 3 hums have ever been firmly tied to a machine. The rest? Untraced. Unproven. Still humming. Maybe the source is always out there. A pipeline, a furnace, a fan we haven't found yet. Or maybe, for the 2% who hear it, the world simply sounds different, in cool morning air, when everyone else hears nothing at all. So what do you think is really behind the hum, and which unsolved case should we follow next? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe to stay with the Unsolved.